Thanks again for joining us this evening. Kelli and I are going to go through a little bit about these dollar values, when to use them, how to use them, and some of the details that are behind them to really get a better feel for understanding how these bioeconomic indexes work. But before we get into a lot of the details, let's take a step back and think about the big picture of dollar values and really what's inside of these. So we know that outputs are going to be what create revenue. And as we think about those outputs, we typically think about those as being our EPDs, or those expected progeny differences, right? What do we expect those animals to do? How do we expect their progeny to perform? And we see that as those outputs. But for every output, we also know that there's going to be an input that's going to be generating expense. And so within these dollar values, or what we call these bioeconomic indexes, it's combining both those outputs and those inputs into one number. So for example, we know that a larger carcass weight, while we see that as being that output that's going to create a lot of revenue, what does it cost to get to that endpoint of that larger carcass weight? And all that's going to be accounted for inside of these dollar values. As we think about the different dollar values that come from the American Angus Association, it's really important to think about what is the goal of your operation? Right? So what is your breeding objective? As you sit down to plan those matings and you think, what genetics do you want to bring into your herd? What direction are you going to be going? So it's having that plan and having that breeding objective to help set you on the right track to have success 5 or 10 years down the road. It's also really important to be consistent with that selection, right? So what are you selecting for? Having that plan in mind and continuing to follow down that path. And then ultimately, how do you know when you get there? Tracking those results, seeing the progress over time. And it's one of those things that we can use these dollar values for. So down below, there's 6 of the 7 dollar values listed from the American Angus Association. And we're going to walk through each of these. And as we do so, I want you to think about your breeding objective, or maybe it's your customer's breeding objective, right? So if you're a seed stock producer, what are your commercial cattlemen using as their breeding objective? What is their plan? And which one of these dollar values really fit into their operation? So we know that dollar values are an incredibly powerful selection tool. So they're going to take multiple traits and their economic impact, and they're going to combine them into one number to be able to make the selection for. So ultimately, these values were created for the commercial cattlemen. They're very simple to use, but keeping in mind that they do create directional change for multiple traits. We also combine them into 2 main categories. That would be both our maternal dollar values and our terminal dollar values. So we're going to take a look at the inside of each one of these. So again, like I mentioned, these are going to be simple to use, creating directional change in multiple traits. And those multiple traits come as component traits. So you can see in this figure that if we look at something like $M that's there in that first column, we can see each of those component traits, or each of those EPDs, that are going to be built inside of that index. But what's really important to understand is that dollar values, they're not EPDs. They're not the same thing, and they're not necessarily used in the same way. The other really big component of this that Kelli's going to talk more about is that dollar values are built on a national breeding objective. And this national breeding objective is, again, really focused on the commercial beef industry. And so it's important that these dollar values are used where those breeding objectives are based from. So as we dig into each one of these dollar values, we're going to start with $M, or that maternal weaned calf value. So this is going to be a value that is expressed in dollars per head. This particular value is taking a look at profitability all the way from conception through weaning. And if we take a look at that specific breeding value, this dollar value would be used in a herd that's keeping the replacement females, and they're selling the cull females and steer mates as feeder calves. If we take a specific look at what does keeping those replacements back look like, it's going to be a 25% replacement rate from those maternal Angus sires with a 20% herd level replacement rate. So Kelli's going to take a deeper dive into exactly what that definition means, but go ahead and get you started thinking about, is this the dollar value that fits within my operation? And listed down below, you can see each of those component trait, or each of those EPDs, that are going to be directly included in this $M value. Now taking a look at $W, so this is our weaned calf value. Again, this is going to be a value that's expressed specifically in dollars per head and looking at that profitability from birth to weaning. So this is going to be a dollar value that's keeping the breeding objective of keeping replacement females and selling cull females and steer mates as feeder calves. So similar to that $M value that we just looked at, but it's going to be looking at a herd replacement rate of 20%. You can also see down below, there's going to be different traits that are included in $W, or fewer traits that are included in $W compared to $M. So taking a look at our last maternal dollar value, this is going to be this cow energy value, or $EN. Now this is going to be a dollar value that it's expressed in terms of dollar savings per cow per year. So this savings is really coming from a difference in lactation energy requirements and then the associated cost with those requirements due to mature cow size. So inside a $EM directly, there would be the milk EPD and the mature weight EPD. And if we take a look at an example of comparing two animals, in this case two sires for their $EN value, sire A is going to have a $EN of +10, and sire B is going to have a $EN of -10. So again, that difference is going to be 20, and that would be a $20 savings per cow per year. So switching gears and looking at those terminal indexes, we're going to start off with $F, or that dollar feedlot value. And this is going to be a value, it's expressed in dollars per head. And it's predicting profitability looking at it from post-weaning to feedlot merit. Okay, so this is going to be for an operation where their breeding objective is where they retain ownership through the feedlot phase. They sell those calves on a carcass weight basis, and they're not concerned about quality or yield grades. So inside a $F, we can see the three traits that are directly included: our post-weaning gain value, our dry matter intake, and then that carcass weight value. Now looking at this $G, or this dollar grid value, again, this is going to be a value that's expressed in terms of dollars per carcass, and it's looking at predicting the profitability differences for carcass grid merit. So this would fit an operation where they retain ownership through the feedlot phase again, but they sell those cattle on an above industry average carcass grid, right? So you're really looking at the quality grade of those carcasses, and how is that going to pay per carcass. And so inside a $G, we would have carcass weight, ribeye area, marbling, and fat. Now if we combine both of those, we can take a look at our $B, or that beef value, and again, it's going to be a value that's expressed in dollars per carcass, and it's looking to predict those profitability differences from weaning time through the rail. And so our $B is a very terminally driven index, and it's based on the breeding objective that all progeny, whether it's a male or a female, are going to be sent to the feedlot and they're going to be harvested on the rail, right? So a very terminally driven index that's combining the traits that are listed down below that we saw in both $F and $G. So the last dollar value that we're going to take a look at is going to be this $C, or dollar combined value. So again, this is going to be a value, it's expressed in dollars per head, and it's looking to predict the profitability throughout the entire production chain. So if we look at the breeding objective that's built behind $C, it's going to be really combining that $M value and that $B value, right? So it's going to be a combined index that's looking at a 20% herd replacement rate each year. Those cull heifers and steers, they're retained through the feedlot phase, and then they're going to be sold on a quality-based carcass grid. So you can see down below each of those component traits, or each of those EPDs, that are going to be directly involved in the $C value. So now Kelli is going to go through really taking a look at what makes these Angus dollar values unique and some of the details behind those different herd replacement rates. So Kelli?
Perfect. Well, thank you, Esther, and thank you guys again for joining us here tonight. I thought Esther did a really nice job of explaining really the overall breeding objectives that are behind these things. And so let's dive just a little bit deeper inside of that particular statement that she made. So when we build out these dollar values, we got to have national breeding objectives that allow us to then put the costs and the revenue sources inside of a breeding system that then allows us to predict the differences between sires and their dollar values. So this particular herd model that we're using is a 500 head self-replacing herd model where we're predicting a bull is going to basically produce 100 calves over his lifetime. So when she talked about the replacement rate, she had mentioned that it's a 25% replacement rate from Angus sires, but a 20% herd level replacement rate. That's because if you go over there and you look on the left side, 100 of the cows that are inside of this 500 head model are used for strictly terminal purposes. So 100 of our cows out of our 500 head cow herd are going to be bred to strictly terminal bulls, where those progeny are going to move on, go into the feedlot, and then get hung on a quality-based grid. From there, that leaves 400 cows, right, where we're really going to develop our replacement heifers out of. So that's that 25% replacement rate from maternal Angus sires. And so using that model, we basically then can build those breeding objectives all the way down the line. But there's a couple of things that are really unique about your Angus dollar values. And these are some of the things that allow us to go in and really make sure that these dollar values are fitting the commercial Angus herds that you guys are utilizing out in the commercial cattle industry. One of the things that is very specific about our maternal weaned calf value index is we have something that are called nonlinear traits fit into those models. And these nonlinear traits are really revolving around maternal milk and calving ease. Why do we fit a nonlinear trait for these two individual EPDs? Because we all know that maternal milk and calving ease, right, can have a really large benefit inside those commercial Angus herds. But when we really get down to it, we reach a point or a threshold inside of these models where we start to see a bit of diminishing returns, meaning we don't see as much value as we continue to linearly increase these traits across the board. And so we've worked to fit in a nonlinear adjustment inside of those. And so if you go ahead and you look at these two graphs, basically what you're going to see is that we have milk on the left-hand side, calving ease direct on the right, and you can see that blue line. And that blue line is this nonlinear curve that we're talking about. And so as you follow up that blue line, you can see that once we get to around 20 to 30 pounds of maternal milk, basically we start to really see the increase in maternal weaned calf value level out due to that specific trait. It doesn't mean that you're going to get discounted for a bull that has a really large, or excuse me, has a maternal milk EPD that might be 30 or above. It just means you're not going to get as much credit moving from 20 to 30 pounds of milk as you would if you go down to the lower side of the scale and you start moving from a 10 milk EPD to a 20 milk EPD. The same is true as you look at calving ease direct. Obviously, as you can see, you gain a lot of profitability in a herd that's moving from using maybe a -5 CED bull to a +5 CED bull. But once we get at about 10 EPD units of calving ease direct, that model really starts to level off, and it's not, again, that you're going to get discounted on maternal weaned calf value for using an individual sire that may have a +15 calving ease direct. It just means that you're not going to continue to gain profitability alone on calving ease direct as it keeps going up in a linear fashion. And so those are a couple of the things that we really wanted to make sure when we rebuilt these dollar value indexes back in 2019 and 2020 that we accounted for, knowing that on the ranch, you start to see the value of something like maternal milk and calving ease level off once, for instance, you start to have females that all calve out unassisted. Another really unique thing that we've been able to build into your terminal index, or that $B index, beef value, is this idea that we can actually garner the relationship between yearling weight and carcass weight, and we can reward more cattle with more carcass weight at a given live weight. So if you go ahead and you look at this graph here, you can start to see individual animals, right, that have very similar, perhaps yearling weight EPDs. So if we start here at 120 yearling weight EPD and we follow this line up, you can see that here's an animal that has a very close to a 120 yearling weight EPD, but his carcass weight alone is less than 40. If we continue to follow that line up and you come up here to this animal, here's an animal that also has a yearling weight EPD of about 120, but you follow that across and he almost has a carcass weight EPD of +70. When you start to analyze those things and we start to think about the profitability that we're going to hang on the rail, obviously this animal up here that has more carcass weight at a 120 yearling weight EPD is going to be more profitable in the end. And because we have so much of your data that Esther and I can utilize to analyze these dollar values, it allows us to be able to fit those specific things inside of your models. Another thing that's unique about your Angus dollar values is specifically your beef index and your $G is that when you look across the industry, most of our index grid premiums are built on an average grid assumption. So basically we use folks like CattleFax in the market to basically tell us, how much money are we going to get for a prime carcass, a CAB carcass, or how much is the select discount. And so what we actually do inside of your Angus dollar values is we go ahead and we work with CattleFax to pull the weekly max grid that had happened across the industry over time. And we also go ahead and we pull the weekly average grid that happened over the last year. And what we actually do is we blend those two individual indexes basically to create this blended average. So basically it's a blend between that weekly max and that weekly average. We blend them together to make these Angus cattle compete on a higher than average quality-based grid inside a $B. Why do we do that? Because we know your cattle, when we think about terminal Angus genetics, are built for quality inside of the marketplace. So we want to ensure that these Angus cattle are continuing to compete on a really competitive value-based grid. One of the questions that Esther and I get a lot over time is how are these traits weighted, right? How much weight, how do we decide how much weight gets placed on marbling versus carcass weight versus mature cow size? And this all has to do with the relative economic impact each one of these individual traits has on commercial cow-calf profitability. So when you think of costs that would be associated with this model, think of things like feed. Feed's a really easy one to wrap our heads around as far as the more feed that we had to input into our cattle, the higher cost to our operation it's going to be. Another cost that you can think about that might not be maybe as easily parsed across the different breeding objectives is the replacement female cost. So if cows are leaving the herd early due to something like docility, right? They're crazy and we have to get them out of the herd because we can't work with them. They have poor foot conformation structure that makes them basically get removed from the herd early on in life. Things like replacement heifer costs can help us evaluate how much pressure we should put on some of those input traits inside of your maternal weaned calf value index. Revenues, things like calf weight. Obviously, we all still get paid on pounds, and so calf weight is a big one that we use across both our maternal and terminal indexes to predict the revenues across our operations, as well as quality premiums. And so really when it gets down to it, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, how much does one unit of change in EPD, how much will that unit of change, whether it's up or down, affect the overall profitability of our commercial cow-calf operations? Then we take that information and we're able to put weights on all these individual EPDs that drive these indexes. As you all know, we update those economic assumptions annually, and they're based on a 7-year rolling average. So this spring, Esther and her team, as well as the AGI team, will work together to update those dollar values that allow us to make sure that the economic assumptions that we're fitting there are consistent with what's happening in the real world commercial cow-calf sector. So when we talk about the relative emphasis on traits, obviously the actual profits, costs, and revenues are going to change over time based on the economic conditions out there in the industry. The other thing that we have to be very sure that we're fitting in correctly is this idea that not only will prices change, not only will these dollar values change as prices change, for instance, feed costs as they continue to rise over the next couple of years, we also need to make sure that the average assumptions that are built inside of these indexes are being used correctly. So we'll also update things like what is the average carcass weight that we're seeing roll through the plants out there in the industry. And we also keep an eye on different things like the percent of females that are getting culled for issues like fertility. Having those economic assumptions and those average assumptions of the industry correct inside of your models is really important so that we can continue to drive the profitability of our herds. So when we try to break down what is the weight of these individual traits inside of this index, Esther and I have worked together to try to group these so you guys can get a little bit more of an inside look as to how these individual traits are weighted inside of these indexes. So let's start up there in the left-hand corner with maternal weaned calf value. As you can see there in the blue, that's your wedge that's really going to be consistent with the number of calves. So when we think of what individual EPDs affects the number of calves that are going to be born on our place, well, things like fertility, heifer pregnancy, whether or not our females are getting bred, that sure has an impact on how many calves we're going to have, as well as other traits like calving ease. Calving ease is one where if a cow can't lay down and have a live calf because it's too big, it goes through a dystocia event and unfortunately we lose that calf. obviously that can have a pretty big impact on how many calves we have to sell at the end of the year. So 23% of that maternal weaned calf index is basically weighted on that kind of number of calves. The next wedge there, 27% in orange, that's your weight of your calves, right? 27% of that emphasis is due to things like weaning weight direct, right? How many pounds do we wean off and have available to sell when it comes time to run those calves through the sale barn or sell them direct to a feedlot, as well as maternal weaned calf value, as well as maternal milk. Obviously, maternal milk is just the maternal pounds of weaning weight added to that calf due to that female's mothering ability. So that can add or subtract pounds based on how well that female does. However, 50% of this maternal weaned calf value index is in gray, and that's going to be your cow cost. Things like how big are your animals are a really good proxy for us to be able to utilize and think through how much is that animal going to cost you to maintain inside of your herd. So mature weight's in there, something like docility is in there. Again, going back to our example, if our females are too flighty to be able to manage on a daily basis, and so we cull her early from the herd due to her docility. Other traits like foot score, where maybe that female comes up with structure or foot problems, we have to remove her from the herd due to that cost. Obviously, the earlier that we remove those females for the herd, the greater cost it's going to be on the maternal weaned calf value index, because of the fact that if we remove them earlier from the herd, the more money that we lose on those individual animals due to that specific culling event. The next one we're going to quickly look at, beef value. This is pretty straightforward for everyone. The orange is going to be 37% of that weighting, and that's going to be those traits that we encounter in the feedlot, the growth and the efficiency. So when we think of things like residual average daily gain, dry matter intake, post-weaning gain, those are the types of traits that we're focusing on in your beef value. And then 63% of that index is actually based on your carcass characteristics. So how much of are you yielding out of that carcass, and how many grid quality premiums are you able to capture? And then finally, your last one, which is basically trying to combine the profitability through those two different sectors, your combined value index, which is basically 34% due to the number of calves and the amount of cow cost. The orange would be 33% based on the weight of the calves and that efficiency through the feedlot. And then 38% being that kind of carcass and yield quality component. And remember, these are commercial breeding objectives where Esther is assuming, and we're all assuming, that only 20% of your animals are going to be kept, of your females are going to be kept as replacements, and the rest of them are going to have retained ownership through the feedlot, and you're going to sell them on a value-based grid. Another way to kind of look at the relative emphasis that each one of these individual traits is going to have on the genetic value or the genetic makeup of your individual cow herd is when we look at these response to selection graphs. And so basically what this graph is telling you is if I only selected on $B for the next 10 years in my herd, what would the EPD profile of my my individual animals on farm change to? So if you look across here, $B is in blue, $M is in green, and $C is in gray. And if you look across this different graph, you can see that when we're selecting just on that terminal value index, you can see considerable growth in weaning weight, yearling weight. You also see an increase in dry matter intake. You come over here to your carcass traits, and you can start to see increased values in carcass weight, marbling, ribeye area, and a decrease in fat, which is how our model would be fit, because we're trying to make sure that we're targeting not only quality, but high yielding type carcasses. For $M, you see a bit of a different story. You start to see some of these boosts on things like calving use direct, lower birth weights. You also start to see increases in things like docility, heifer pregnancy, and you start to see your foot score EPDs go in the right direction, which would be a decrease heading back to that 5 foot score that's on your foot scoring guide. Probably the largest difference that you're going to see here between M and B relative to these two indexes is this decrease in mature cow size. Like we said, with $B, we have a lot of emphasis on growth and carcass traits. Obviously, there's a correlation between the growth that we get in the pre-weaning sector, the post-weaning sector, and as a mature cow. And so when you look across there, if you're just selecting on $B, you're starting to put a lot of upward pressure on something like mature cow size. On the other side of the coin, like we just talked about, 50% of your maternal weaned calf value index is placed on those cost traits. And so you can see a pretty big downward emphasis on something like mature cow size. However, when I go out in the industry, and Esther goes out in the industry, and we talk to commercial cattlemen, the one thing that we like to bring up is right over here in weaning weight and yearling weight. So even though probably a lot of our commercial cattlemen have this idea where they're keeping their own replacements and selling the rest of their cull females and steer mates through the feedlot and may or may not be retaining ownership, if you're focusing just on maternal weaned calf value, something that we want to think about is the fact that we do start to hold weaning weight EPD constant with this maternal weaned calf value index. That doesn't mean that we're going to decrease the weaning weight value of our calves as they are today. It just means if we only selected on $M over the next 10 years, we wouldn't see an increase in weaning weight EPD. With that, you actually start to see a slight decrease in something like weaning weight and carcass weight inside of that $M index. That's not because we're putting a downward pressure, right, or a negative weighting on yearling weight and carcass weight in $M. They're not even in that index, but because of that correlated trait nature, basically you're going to see some of those things start to decrease. And so it's important that even though we may have commercial cattle producers that are really solely selecting, right, on that profitability, we need to make sure and think about who's going to be on the seats for those cattle to purchase those cattle out of the sale barn or to purchase them directly from that individual commercial cow-calf guy when it comes time to sell those individual cattle. That's where $C comes in. And a lot of times we get the comments in the feedback, right, that $C looks like it's highly correlated with $B. And when you look at this selection graph, I would say that probably aligns with what you're thinking. But I think the biggest points out of here is when we come over here with your weaning weight and yearling weight, we still have upward pressure, right, on weaning weight and yearling weight like we would see in $B. So that's a nice offset to our maternal weaned calf value index where we're actually starting to see those things hold constant. And then when you come over here and you look at things like your cow cost or your mature size, you can start to see that we make an increase in docility, a slight increase in heifer pregnancy. We continue to put some pressure on maternal milk. But with that, you can see that $C versus $B, we're only increasing this mature cow size to about half of what we would see if we selected on $B alone. So thinking through these things, we're trying to balance that index so that way we can appropriately weight whole chain profitability. So to kind of just sum up some things before Esther and I take some questions, things to keep in mind, maternal weaned calf value, that's your most maternally driven index, right, that we put out there. It moves things like heifer pregnancy, fertility, docility, foot structure in a positive direction, and it places quite a bit of downward pressure on mature cow size. Something like beef value, that's kind of our tried and true terminal index that we have out there in the industry, and that's going to continue to put pressure on things like increased growth, increased quality grade premiums, increased yield, and with that, though, with all that increased growth, we're still going to see, right, continued increases on correlated traits like mature cow weights. And so that's just one thing we need to be aware of if we're solely focusing on $B as your criteria. If you're getting rid of all your offspring and you're selling them through the feedlot, it's probably not a big issue. But if you have to maintain a profitable cow herd, it may be something we want to keep in mind. And then finally, with your combined value, we're going to continue to increase things like growth and carcass traits at a similar rate to $B, but we're going to start to put some pretty good bumpers up around maternal traits like fertility, foot score, docility, and then that mature cow size. So with that, things to keep in mind overall, dollar values are built on national breeding objectives. If you're having an individual incidence, let's say a higher rate of calving dystocia in your herd, you may need to put some extra emphasis on something like calving ease direct or calving ease maternal outside of what these dollar values do. And so you still need to be paying attention to what the issues are in your individual cow herd, and we still need our really great Angus breeders to breed cattle based on all the component parts to make sure we have really great bulls and females to deliver into the commercial cattle industry. With that, economic assumptions are updated yearly, but based on a 7-year rolling average. That kind of follows our cattle cycle that's out there today. As assumptions update, whether that be trait weights, percentage of animals being culled, things like that, dollar value outcomes will be affected. And then finally, dollar values will be updated and refined as new traits come on board and are characterized. So obviously you guys have been hearing about our functional longevity research that we've been doing. How long and how many calves do cows leave in the individual herd? That could be a dollar value update that we fit in later on because of the fact that we now have that trait characterized inside of the Angus population. So with that, we're going to close. We want to say thank you for joining us, and we're open to take some questions.
Well, perfect. We have some great questions that have been submitted by you all in our audience. We're going to try our best to get through as many as we can as time allows. And you'll see that we have Miss Esther Tarpoff, right, Esther, now on screen too. And so we'll work together and we'll take some of these questions. If we get into a time constraint, we don't get to your question that you may have asked, we'll make sure that we follow up with you through email correspondence. And so Esther, we'll kind of get started here. So one question that had come through the chat as we were kind of going through that is one that really kind of hits on the basics of our different dollar values. And the question was asked, what's the difference in how do we characterize a trait that is a maternal trait versus a terminal trait?
Yeah, Kelly, so that's a good question. Definitely something to make sure that's clear from the start. So our maternal type traits are going to be those, we think about those replacements that are going to be going back into the cow herd, right? Those females that are going to continue to have progeny generation after generation. We think about that more on the maternal side of it. Whenever we think about the terminal side of the equation, those would be those animals that are going to be more focused for the feedlot, right? They have a terminal end. They're going to end up as beef at the end of the day. And so those would be more of our terminally driven traits or indexes.
Perfect. Another question that we have here is that we talked a little bit about maternal milk and calving yeast direct and how those two traits are fit in there as kind of nonlinear traits. And we spent a little bit of time discussing that. Maybe Esther, in your own words, how do you describe a nonlinear trait and what does that mean when we fit them in there like that?
Yeah, so those nonlinear traits that are going to be inside a $M, both for that maternal milk and the calving yeast, I think about nonlinear traits of sometimes it's easier to think about what a linear trait is, right? And that's going to be that trait that continues. Think about it going kind of in one direction on up or down for that matter, but it's going to be going in a straight line, same amount of credit each step up. If we think about something that's nonlinear, it's going to be, I don't want to say where it plateaus, but it's not going to continue on that straight upward. And so I think about it as we think about how those are fit inside of something like $M. An animal could have, say, a really high milk or a really high calving yeast, but they're not going to continue to be able to improve that $M value solely based on that, because at some point we have what I'm going to say enough of to do what it needs to do.
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. So basically a linear trait would just be kind of a straight line up and to the right. And so if we think about something like maternal milk, if you kept getting higher and higher milk EPDs, you would get higher and higher maternal wean calf values, regardless of what the added cost would be to that maternal milk component.
Yeah, exactly.
So from there, we got a question about some traits that aren't currently in the $M index. And one of those traits is dry matter intake. So dry matter intake is included in beef value, obviously, from that standpoint. So we can kind of characterize feedlot efficiency. What are your thoughts on trying to fit that inside a $M or maybe some thoughts as to why it's not included in $M today?
Yeah, and Kelly, I'll definitely let you chime in on this one as well. But as we think about that DMI value, I think about really what's that based on, and it's going to be based off of more of those feed intake type systems, right? It's not necessarily, we don't know that it's characterizing those cows that are out grazing, right? That's not necessarily, I guess, the data that's going to be based on, but I guess I think about it from that perspective. But Kelly, I'll let you add in anything on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think with our dry matter intake EPDs that we have today, they're characterized on cattle that are going through that post-weaning phase. So kind of it's between kind of that weaning and yearling phase of life. And that's where the majority of our data is getting captured on. And it's getting captured on animals that are probably on a bit hotter diet than just our cows that are out walking on grass. And so there's been quite a bit of debate kind of through the research and those sorts of things as to whether the dry matter intake that we characterize in that portion of their lifetime through that post-weaning gain phase is indicative of what those cows will do as they start grazing. The one thing that we do though, right, Esther, is we use things like mature weight, maternal milk to kind of get a proxy at what their maintenance energy costs would be. So then we could go ahead and then basically fit in how much is that animal going to cost us to feed inside of that maternal profitability index because of the fact that, she's this size, she has this much maternal milking ability, and this is how much it's going to have to cost to offset her maintenance energy requirements.
Yep.
From there, we had another question here. And kind of going back to the beginning of your talk, Esther, it says, I'm a commercial cattle producer. How do I determine which dollar value to pay most attention to?
Yeah, so again, very, very good question. As you think about heading down, commercial cattle producer, that's exactly what these dollar values were built for, was with a commercial cattleman in mind. And so that really goes back to the basics of what are your breeding objectives? What direction are you headed? And so making sure that whatever dollar value you choose to place emphasis on really fits with your scenario. Are you keeping replacements? Are you not? Are you retaining ownership through the feedlot? Are you selling on a carcass basis? Or are you selling, on a quality grid? So most definitely keeping those things in mind. But I'd also encourage you, work with your seed stock supplier, talk to them, pick their brain a little bit about here's what you're trying to do or what you're doing today and where you want to go, and definitely get their input as well on what they have to offer.
Yeah. Probably the best question to ask yourself, right, Esther, is how do you make your money, right? If you make your money selling weaned calves, or if you're making money retaining ownership or selling on a value-based grid. So, another question that we have here is another great one. In the future, will traits like foot score be included in $B, as that might impact basically feedlot performance?
I'm probably going to look for you on input as well on this particular one. I guess I don't maybe want to focus in too hard on just one particular trait inside of $1 value, but we do continue, just like you mentioned with functional longevity, we do continue to look for ways to continue to add and refine those dollar values. But I don't know if you have any specific comments to what was asked.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I saw that one roll through as we were kind of watching our presentation, and boy, how we love watching ourselves, right? Give a presentation. And so as I thought about that one, I think the biggest takeaway for me is with that foot score EPD, we don't really see, and you see this in your data, right, Esther? We don't really see a lot of variation in cattle that are less than 18 months of age. And so it would kind of beg the question of how much specifically about the trait that we're looking at, which is that foot conformation trait, foot angle, length of toes, curl to the toes, those sorts of things. Do they impact an animal early enough in life to actually have a deficit, right, or have a negative effect on those cattle in the feedlot? I suppose the really extreme examples, perhaps, but right now, based on our data, I would say we probably don't see that impacting cattle early enough in life to make it a good tool to be able to fit in there from a profitability standpoint. But just like everything we do, right, Esther, we'll continue to monitor it and see how it kind of progresses in the future.
Yep.
Another question, and these ones are probably a little less about indexes and kind of a little bit about our input traits that are inside of our dollar value indexes. So this one here says, does an EPD become more accurate the longer an animal is in production?
So it's an interesting question. I would say yes and no. I'd say it can become more accurate with more data and more information. So an animal could be in production, but if there's not data continuing to flow in to help that evaluation and really work with that evaluation, it's not going to become more accurate because there's no new information to help it do so. But as long as there's information, continuing to come in, yeah, you can absolutely work to improve those accuracies, because the more we know, the more we're able to evaluate inside the evaluation.
Yeah. So just like progeny data is king, even in the era of genomics, right? So they send in more data and it's good, then that definitely plays an important role. So we have another question. It says, I've seen that some places there isn't an emphasis on $EN. Is this not a very important trait with the cost of feed?
What are your thoughts on that one, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I think $EN, there's two traits included in that particular index, right? Mature cow size in maternal milk. And so I think with the cost of feed, you might see some people place some more individual emphasis on something like $EN. I think for the most part, though, the majority of the breeders, and I don't know, Esther, if you have any thoughts on this, but the majority of the breeders that I work with that call in and ask questions about $EN are those that are in a pretty resource limited environment. So kind of go out west, you get into kind of some of the more mountain ranges, those sorts of things, kind of some of more of those desert type areas. That's where I see people putting a lot of emphasis on $EN, just from the sheer fact that they really want to kind of control those cow traits, right? They can't have cows out there that require too much have too high of maintenance energy requirement because of the fact that, quite frankly, those cows aren't going to last very long, or they're not going to be able to wean off a big calf, or in some cases, they might not even get bred. And so that's where I see most of our individuals that are focusing on $EN is probably in those super resource limited environments.
Very much looking at what's your environment, what resources do you have to offer, and then fitting the cows to your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one we have here is, why does the fat EPD increase with the selection of $M? Is it due to the correlations with maternal traits? So I think they're talking about on those bar charts, you see the fat EPD increase, even though it's not directly fit into that index.
Yeah, there'd be, Kelli, again, you can chime in here, but there would be correlation there with other traits that would absolutely be causing that to increase. Because again, like as she explained with some other traits, even though they're not directly fit in there, there could be that correlation that's also affecting that particular trait.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. So, so this individual is a seed stock and a commercial breeder. And they asked, what is the most important dollar value for both the seed stock and the commercial industry?
I think this goes, obviously, I'm going to go back to those breeding objectives. What direction really are you headed? Or where do you want to go? And I'm not going to say, maybe there's one that's more important, because it's going to be based on your scenario and what fits with those breeding objectives, but maybe you have something else to add there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think everything that we do is really focus on the commercial cattle industry. And so all of those indexes, and like we talked about, your breeding objective that's fit inside of that whole kind of system is really based on a commercial breeding objective. And I think at the end of the day, at least the feedback that I get from seed stock producers is the fact that we still need to continue to, or they still need to continue to look at all the individual traits, right, Esther? I mean, I think and you've said it before, right? You can get to the top of a dollar value in multiple different ways based on kind of the admixture of EPDs that you have on your individual animals. And so making sure that you kind of fill the holes in order to enable your commercial producers to really be successful kind of in the next stage and down the line. So one follow-up question on $EN, it says, do you feel that just two traits fairly evaluate $EN? So $EN, that's that cow savings index, right? That's that energy cow savings index. I think at the end of the day, that individual index was built to try and explain and identify profitability changes when your maintenance energy requirements go up or down for that individual animal. And unfortunately, right, the only two real tools that we have to try to get at maintenance energy requirements is body size, right, with mature cow size and mature cow weight, along with whatever maintenance energy requirements would be needed given that level of maternal milk EPDs. So I think that's kind of where we land when we start to think about something like $EN. But with that, looks like we're just running right up against the clock here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to sign off for the night. But if we didn't get to your question, like we said, don't worry. Esther or I will be in touch via email, and we're happy to follow up with you. And I know that I speak for both of us, Esther, when I say, hey, if you got questions, go ahead and give us a ring. We're in the office, send us an email. We're happy to help and continue to allow people to learn more about what we're doing every day in the office. So